I'd like to share with you 5 examples of successful candidate journeys in a bit to help you to understand how to sell yourself in job interviews. And as you're going to see next, it's quite different by the type of role you're applying for. The first example, if you're preparing for a behavioral interview, the most common piece of advice you'll ever hear would be to structure your answers in the STAR format. Still, one of my clients, working now as a director of global branding with Netflix, never used the STAR format when communicating their answers in their job interviews for the behavioral part. He used the STAR format, as a generic method, as a first version of their answer, so I could understand what their story bank was about. But the final product, the final answer, was never in the STAR format. Another example for the same candidate, I often advise people, don't get into storytelling. Tell me about yourself unless you're a natural storyteller. This candidate, again, director of global branding, did exactly the opposite. They focused entirely on storytelling because they knew how to do it. They were not necessarily a natural storyteller, but since their subject matter expertise allowed them to brand themselves as such, this is a strategy they employed successfully. Okay, so this was the first example. The second example, for a finance manager working at Amazon, it's often good advice to be a nice person, to be a well-intentioned candidate, and to express a little bit of optimism during your job interviews. This candidate was anything but Mr. Nice Guy. Like, throughout our exchanges, not the most reliable, not the most communicative. He didn't really like following the advice I was providing them with. Yet still they passed their job interview. And I wanted to highlight here that as a senior finance manager, you don't have to play Mr. Nice Guy. Okay? For other roles, it might be great advice to play Mr. Nice Guy, and I'm also gonna demonstrate next. But for this, in case of senior finance manager, you have to be frugal. You have to, build a bit of rapport to show Mr. Tough Guy, so to speak, in these job interviews, and these were their main selling point. Okay, they didn't pass it from the first try, but they were well qualified, and the second time they prepared a bit better and they passed, but they didn't change much about their sales approach. Right? The third example I'd like to share with you would be for a senior finance analyst. Okay, so an analyst, not a finance manager. Okay, and in this case, the main advice or the main selling point of the candidate was actually quite the opposite of the senior finance manager. They were extremely helpful, they were extremely communicative, they worked really hard to prepare for their job interviews and passed it. So passed it fully on merit, so to speak, but they were a very nice person, smiling, very easy to work with, easy to communicate, and exactly the opposite of the senior finance manager, right? So this is a clear example of how different types of selling strategies work for different types of roles in these job interviews. The fourth example I'd like to share with you would be for a senior program manager. This person, at first, you'll hear probably that in job interviews you have to sell yourself in a way that, maybe you have to make some metrics look a bit better about yourself. And if you ask the AI, for instance, to improve your answers, or even if you don't ask them to improve your answers, they will suggest that you come up with some interesting metrics, and they would, maybe suggest even the metrics themselves. So long story short, it is very common advice that you should not be very truthful in these job interviews, and you should play on these, you should sell yourself, so to speak. And this is exactly what this candidate did. They had a background in as a senior PM in fintech. They speak very well, and this is how they went to their first interview. They bluffed their "tell me about yourself." They presented a metric they didn't fully own, and what happened is the interviewer spotted something fishy in the interview, and they followed up for the rest of the interview, specifically on that metric. they failed their interview because they bluffed on that metric. Still, because they were really good at what they did, next time they came in, they focused on, presenting only the facts, or of being accurate, and no longer selling themselves, so to speak, on bluffing, which, by the way, extremely rarely works in job interviews, in my experience with high-performing companies, and they passed it, right? So this was their key selling point, that, hey, yes, I speak well, I prepared your interview, and then I pass it. I don't have to bluff at any point in time. And this was what worked as a selling point for them. And finally, last but not least, for a principal PM. Okay, so previously I talked about a senior PM, now this is a principal PM. This person was one of the best candidates I've ever had to interview behaviorally. We could, if you know about Amazon's now 16 leadership principles, at the time there were only 14, we were able to go twice through all those 14 leadership principles in 50 minutes. They gave the great answers. They didn't start rambling. They weren't too concise, but they just had the right amount of information. So for a principal PM, these sort of things of communicating your achievements, needless to say, they did have achievements to communicate as well, but focusing on communicating extremely well during your job interviews and giving answers, for a principal PM played a significant role to their success. This is when compared, with the senior PM, which, they speak well, they were relatively qualified, but they prepared a lot for the interview, so they could, somewhat force themselves to speak a little bit better without bluffing. The principal PM, in other words, the principal PM already knew the achievements, but they focused on communicating at another level, even at an executive level, so to speak, to the extent that they impressed their interviewer. So as you see here, for a director of global branding, they could use storytelling because they know what they're doing. They could not use star format because, again, they know what they're doing. For a senior PM, they must use the star format. If you don't use the star format in a senior PM interview, you won't pass it. Or for a senior analyst, again, you must use the star format. That's your bread and butter if you do it. For a finance manager, well, maybe not so much because that's executive communication. Still, these people use them. But again, the senior finance manager was nowhere near Mr. Nice Guy. I would even call that guy an arrogant person. Okay, but this is what worked for them for their specific role. Finance managers aren't supposed to be Mr. Nice Guy, right? This is when compared to maybe a customer-facing product manager. So what I'm suggesting you here, find what sells for the type of role that you're applying for in this job interviews and corroborate that with your strengths that you have, that you're really good at. And this would be the magic formula for you to sell yourself, so to speak, in job interviews. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.